Welcome to PMP certification training. In this lesson, we're going to cover the project management processes. So what we're going to do is discuss process group interactions. We're going to talk about the inputs, and then we're going to talk about where that's located in PMBOK. Before we get started, let's talk about the 5 groups. So we have the initiating group, the planning, the executing process group, the monitoring, controlling, and the closing process group. Now, if you think about it, one thing to keep in mind is that we're teaching this course from the aspect of an extremely large project so that we can encompass everything into it. While all projects may not have all of the processes, all projects should go through all of the 5 groups, if you will. So they should go through an initiation, a planning, an execution. You should have monitoring and controlling, and then you should have a closeout. Now, one thing we mentioned before is that you may have iterations or repeated processes within a project. Now, not all projects will have iterative phases. Okay, some projects you'll just kind of do one iteration, you're through it, and you're done. But larger project, a more complex project, may have little iterative phases where you keep repeating a lot of these processes. So we'll discuss that more, but keep that in mind as we move forward. Now, a lot of the groups have interactions. So this chart that you're looking here on 1-5 kind of gives you an idea of where these process groups start and where they end. So if you look at this, when we start at the beginning, you notice that 4 of the 5 processes start relatively close to the beginning. It's not until we get into the execution phase or the planning phase down where we start to see the start of the closing process group. And the reason that is because in the executing process, you may have vendors or subcontractors or resources that are providing work that you need to complete that part of the work. They need to be closed out, paid, etc. So that's why you start to see the beginning of that closing process group. You see that we kind of do the planning is more intensive up front, and as you get towards the end of the project, the planning gets reduced, and then you see the curve with the execution process. You'll notice that monitoring and controlling starts and continues all the way to the finish. And then, of course, you see the closing process, how it kind of moves up and then it winds down, and it's the last of the processes. So when we talk about the initiation or initiating process group, let's think about that. So initiating a project, okay? So at a high level, when we initiate the process group or the initiating process, at a high level, these processes are designed at the initiation phase. The processes that we have in this group are designed to get your project off the ground. And we look at the inputs, at least from a high level, that are required for you to get a project started. And then we look at what these processes are designed to do for us in the initiation phase. So, perform assessments with stakeholders, identifying deliverables, stakeholder analysis, high-level risk identification and planning, project charters, et cetera, and et cetera. So keep in mind that the inputs and activities of the initiation or initiating process group are going to be extremely important from an exam perspective, because these are the inputs that get your project moving. Now, one thing I want to point out is that we're dealing with a lot of these are living documents. So your business documents, your project management plan, some of your project documents, which we'll later talk about, like risk mitigation plan, and stuff of that nature. They're living documents. And what I mean by living documents is you're going to constantly update them through the project. As the project develops and as you execute, you need to keep in mind that these documents need to be updated. So that's why we call them living documents. They're very, very dynamic in their content, and responsibly so. You should continue to update them as you gain new information, as events happen throughout the process. But you need to understand these for the exam. Now, when we talk about the planning process group, we also look at some of the high-level inputs. And then, of course, when we get into the planning, we're refining any requirements or gathering requirements. We're developing scope cost baselines. A number of these things in the actions taken or what happened throughout the planning process group. Now we get into execution. This is where the rubber meets the road. So we start putting our plan into action and we get moving. The inputs as designated on the left are a lot of the high level. Now you'll notice that the EEFs down at the bottom of that, enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets, those are going to pretty much remain constant throughout your project. You're always going to be utilizing those as some of the resources because of their availability when we're talking about OPAs. And then you're always subject to any kind of environmental factors that are present, not only within your internally to your organization or externally to your organization. So that's why you constantly see these as inputs. You need to be constantly taking those into consideration. Now, monitoring and controlling, this is extremely important. Your monitoring and controlling starts at the very beginning of your project and continues through every phase of your project, from the beginning all the way to the end, and quite understandably so. I mean, let's take a look at this. So what do we mean by monitoring and controlling? When we're talking about monitoring a project, we're talking about making sure it's going according to plan, making sure we're aware of any potential risks that might affect the execution of the plan or the work performance of the plan, controlling any changes, being aware of any enterprise environmental factors, changes to any kind of assets of the organization. I mean, let's face it, right? There's a bunch of stuff. There's many things that can happen during the course of a project, and quite understandably, you need to be monitoring all levels of this project to make sure the project stays on track and doesn't run astray of the plan or is not affected adversely. So you're constantly monitoring, and then when these events do occur, because they will occur in one aspect or another, that you've got a plan in place and that you're controlling those changes, or you're controlling the effect that those events, if you will, or changes have on your process. And we look at here on the right side with some of the actions taken with regards to the monitoring and controlling. We talk about baseline management. We talk about any kind of change management. We talk about verifying and monitoring deliverables or monitoring and assessing risk, reviewing any events that may be part of your issue log, always continuously capturing and analyzing and recording and saving data that happens, and then, keeping an eye on any procurement activities or resources as they're gathered for your project. And last but not least, if everything goes well, successfully or unsuccessfully, for that matter, because we still have a closeout when we get into the closing of a project, because a project could be terminated earlier due to any number of factors, as we've discussed earlier. And when that happens, you're still going to go through closing out a project. So please keep that in mind. Just because a project gets terminated earlier does not mean you don't close. It may affect how the processes take shape, or which processes are more important than other, but it does not preclude you from going through a closing. So, and again, you'll see here, project charter, project documents, management plan, all this stuff looks familiar, right? Right. As we mentioned before, this stuff they're living documents, and you have to close this stuff out. So, when we talk about closing, we're talking about, getting final acceptance, maybe transferring ownership, closing legal or financial accounts or responsibility, recording any data that's learned from the project, archiving things. And then, of course, last but definitely not least, we want to make sure that we grab any relative feedback from stakeholders or anybody that was part of the project and evaluate. That's not only good for the project and the project team, it's excellent for the project manager, and goes hand in hand with, enhancing your ability to be successful in subsequent projects. So in brief, covering this area for lesson 3B, we basically ran briefly through the 5 process groups, if you will. If you don't have a clear understanding of mentally, just in a framework of these 5 groups and how they relate to each other and what order they go in. Before you move to section 3C, I would suggest you spend a little time and just wrap your mind around at a high level, memorizing these, understanding kind of what their place is as a project, because it's going to be extremely important moving forward into the next lessons when these are talked about, because they will be talked about in great detail, that you understand the relationship between the phases. And not only are they linear, but they overlap an extensive amount. And that was on the diagram at the beginning of this lesson.